Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you very much. Well, welcome. Good morning. Good morning. Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to Greenwich. And I invite you, first of all, to do what I'm sure you've done before, is to raise your eyes to the heavens, because the Vatican has Michelangelo, Greenwich has Thornhill, who spent 20 years flat on his back on top of scaffolding, and so rigid that his arm became permanently wonky. And he's left us this gorgeous and slightly bonkers symbolic scene that captures the spirit of the United Kingdom in the early 18th century. This painting above you was started in 1707, the very year when the Union of Scotland was agreed, and does it not speak of supreme national self-confidence? Look at these well-fed nymphs and cupids and what have you. They are not just celebrating the triumph of liberty and peace over tyranny, the official title of the scene. This is the settlement of a long and divisive political question about who gets to sit on the throne of England, and it is visibly resolved, as you can see, in favour of William and Mary, and the result is stability and certainty and optimism and an explosion of global trade propelled by new maritime technology. And above around us you can see the anchors, cables, rudders, sails, oars, ensigns, powder barrels, sextants, the compasses, the grappling irons. In fact, the only important bit of kit that is missing is Harrison's sea clock, also exhibited close by here in Greenwich, and also commissioned in the same era, that allowed every ship in the world to determine how far they were from this meridian. So this is it. This is the newly forged United Kingdom on the slipway. This is the moment when it all took off, and you know where this is going today. If we get it right, if we have the courage to follow the instincts and the instructions of the British people, this can be another such moment on the launching pad, because once again, we have settled a long-running question of sovereign authority. We have ended a debate that has run for 3.5 years, some would say 47 years. I won't even mention the name of the controversy, except to say that it begins with B and it's receding in the past behind us. We have the opportunity. We have the newly recaptured powers. We know where we want to go. And that is out into the world. And today, in Geneva, our ambassador, Julian Braithwaite, moves seats in the World Trade Organization and takes back control of our tariff schedules, an event that itself deserves to be immortalized in oil. This country is leaving its chrysalis. We are re-emerging after decades of hibernation as a campaigner for global free trade. And frankly, it is not a moment too soon, because the argument for this fundamental liberty is now not being made. We in the global community are in danger of forgetting the key insight of those great Scottish thinkers, the invisible hand of Adam Smith, and of course David Ricardo's more subtle but indispensable principle of comparative advantage, which teaches that if countries learn to specialize and exchange, then overall wealth will increase and productivity will increase, leading Cobden to conclude that free trade is God's diplomacy, the only certain way of uniting people in the bonds of peace. Since the more freely goods cross borders, the less likely it is that troops will ever cross borders. And since these notions were born here in this country, it has been free trade that has done more than any other single economic idea to raise billions out of poverty, and incredibly fast. In 1990, there were 37% of the world's population in absolute poverty. That is now down to less than 10%. And yet, my friends, I am here to warn you today that this beneficial magic is fading. Free trade is being choked. And that is no fault of the people. That's no fault of individual consumers. I'm afraid it is the politicians who are failing to lead. The mercantilists are everywhere. The protectionists are gaining ground. From Brussels to China to Washington, tariffs are being waved around like cudgels, even in debates on foreign policy, where frankly they have no place. And there is an ever-growing proliferation of non-tariff barriers. And the resulting tensions are letting the air out of the tires of the world economy. World trade volumes are lagging behind global growth. Trade used to grow at roughly double global GDP, 1987 to 2007. Now it barely keeps pace. And global growth is itself anemic. And the decline in global poverty that I referred to, that decline is itself now starting to slow. And in that context, when we're starting to hear some bizarre autarkic rhetoric, when barriers are going up, and when there is a risk that new diseases such as coronavirus will trigger a panic and a desire for market segregation that go beyond what is medically rational to the point of doing real and unnecessary economic damage, then, at that moment, humanity needs some government somewhere that is willing at least to make the case powerfully for freedom of exchange. Some country ready to take off its Clark Kent spectacles and leap into the phone booth and emerge with its cloak flowing as the supercharged champion of the right of populations of the earth to buy and sell freely among each other. And here in Greenwich in the first week of February 2020, I can tell you in all humility that the UK is ready for that role. We're ready for the great multi-dimensional game of chess in which we engage in more than one negotiation at once. And we are limbering up to use nerves and muscles and instincts that this country has not had to use for half a century. Secretary of State Liz Truss tells me she has the teams in place. Is that right, Liz? Yes. She has the lawyers, top dollar I've no doubt, economists, trade policy experts. And if we don't have enough, and if they don't perform, believe me, we'll hire some more. We will reach out to the Commonwealth, which now has some of the fastest growing economies in the world. It was fantastic at the recent Africa summit to see how many wanted to turn that great family of nations into a free trade zone, even if we have to begin with clumps and groups. We will take these ideas forward at Kigali in June. We will engage with Japan and other Trans-Pacific Agreement countries, with old friends and partners, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, on whom we deliberately turned our backs in the early 1970s. We will get going with our friends in America. And I share the optimism of President Trump. And I say to all the naive and juvenile anti-Americans in this country, if there are any, there seem to be some, I say, grow up and get a grip. The US already buys 1/5 of everything we export. And yes, of course, there are going to be difficulties, and our shower trays still seem to fall foul of US rules, Liz. And if you want to sell insurance across America, Mr. Ambassador, you still have to deal with 50 separate regulators. And it is high time, I think we all agree, that they cut their punitive tariffs on Scotch whisky. And it goes without saying to all those conspiracy theorists who may still be in existence, all those believers in the Bermuda Triangle, or who think that Elvis is shortly to be found on Mars, it goes without saying that the NHS is not on the table. And we will not accept any diminution in food, hygiene, or animal welfare standards. But I must say to the America bashers in this country, if there are any, in doing free trade deals, we will be governed by science and not by mumbo-jumbo, because the potential is enormous. And of course, that brings me to the other area where the potential is perhaps even greater. We want a thriving trade and economic relationship with the EU. Our historic friends, partners, neighbours, and I shall today be tabling a parliamentary statement spelling out our objectives. And at the outset, I just want to say to our friends, I want to reassure you about one thing. I want to lay one myth to rest. We will not engage in some cutthroat race to the bottom. We are not leaving the EU to undermine European standards. We will not engage in any kind of dumping, whether commercial or social or environmental. And don't just listen to what I say or what we say. Look at what we do. And I say respectfully to our friends that in all those three crucial areas that I just mentioned, the anxiety should really be on our side of the channel, not yours. Look at state aid. France spends twice as much on state aid as the UK. Germany, 3 times as much. Who's using subsidies to undercut? Not the UK. In fact, the EU has enforced state aid rules against the UK only 4 times in the last 21 years, compared with 29 enforcement actions against France, 45 against Italy, and 67 against Germany. The same applies even more emphatically to social policy. And here again, I dispel the absurd caricature of Britain as a nation bent on the slash and burn of workers' rights and environmental protection, as if we are saved from Dickensian squalor only by enlightened EU regulation, as if it was only thanks to Brussels that we're not preparing to send children back up chimneys. In one field after another, Britain is far ahead. The EU waited until last year before introducing 2 weeks of paid paternity leave. We in the UK guaranteed that right nearly 2 decades ago. The EU gives employees the right to request flexible working only if they are parents or carers. The UK provides that right to every employee with more than 6 months' service, and they can make the request for any reason. The EU provides a minimum of 14 weeks paid maternity leave. Britain offers up to a year with 39 weeks paid and an option to convert this to shared parental leave. How about that? The UK has a higher minimum wage than all but 3 EU member states. In fact, 6 EU countries have no minimum wage at all. As for the environment, look at animal welfare. It's not just that we want to go further than the EU in banning live shipment of animals. There are ways in which we are already further ahead. The UK banned veal crates fully 16 years before the EU. We are protecting elephants by introducing one of the strictest ivory bans in the world. And the EU, meanwhile, is still in the consultation stage. And on the great environmental issue of our time, perhaps the greatest issue facing humanity, Britain was the first major economy in the world, let alone the EU, to place upon our own shoulders a legal obligation to be carbon neutral by 2050. That will put huge strains on our system. We know that, Saj. It will require thought and effort and change. But we know we can do it. We've cut carbon emissions by nearly twice the EU average since 1990, 42%. We've cut, while the GDP has grown by about 70%. But here is the question. Are we going to insist that the EU does everything that we do as the price of free trade? Are we? Of course not. Our legislation to ban single-use plastics goes further and faster than anything proposed by the EU. Does that mean we will refuse to accept a zero-tariff, zero-quota deal with the EU unless the EU agrees to match us every step of the way? Will we stop Italian cars or German wine? No stereotypes here. From entering this country tariff-free or quota-free unless the EU matches our UK laws on plastic coffee stirrers or maternity leave? Or unless they match our laws in any other field of policy that might conceivably affect the production of an Alfa Romeo or a bottle of Gewürztraminer? Will we accuse them of dumping? Of course not. Or wanting to dump? Of course not. So I hope our friends will understand that what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. There is no need for a free trade agreement to involve accepting EU rules on competition policies, subsidies, social protection, the environment, or anything similar, any more than the EU should be obliged to accept UK rules. The UK will maintain the highest standards in these areas, better in many respects than those of the EU, without the compulsion of a treaty. And it is vital to say this now, clearly, because we have so often been told that we must choose between full access to the EU market, along with accepting its rules and courts, on the Norway model, or a free trade agreement, which opens up markets and avoids the full panoply of EU regulation, like the Canada deal. Well, folks, I hope you got the message by now. We've made a choice. We want a comprehensive free trade agreement similar to Canada's. But in the unlikely event that we do not succeed, then our trade will have to be based on our existing withdrawal agreement with the EU. And let's be clear, the choice is emphatically not deal or no deal. We have a deal. We've done it. And it did indeed turn out, as I correctly prophesied, to be oven ready. The question is whether we agree a trading relationship with the EU comparable to Canada's or more like Australia's. And I have no doubt that in either case, the UK will prosper mightily. And of course, our new relationship with our closest neighbours will range far beyond trade. We will seek a pragmatic agreement on security, on protecting our citizens without trespassing on the autonomy of our respective legal systems. I hope that we can reach an agreement on aviation, allowing cheap flights to continue. We are ready to consider an agreement on fisheries. But it must reflect the fact that the UK will be an independent coastal state at the end of this year, 2020, controlling our own waters, and under such an agreement, there will be annual negotiations with the EU using the latest scientific data, ensuring that British fishing grounds are first and foremost for British boats. And in this and in all these other areas, I see the need for for warmth, and we'll get that. For warmth, we'll deliver that. For cooperation, for friendship, for exchange, for all the va-et-vient that has come to be so important for our academics, for our students, for our businesses. But I see no need to bind ourselves to an agreement with the EU. We will restore full sovereign control over our borders and immigration, competition, subsidy rules, procurement, data protection. And while we will always cooperate with our European friends in foreign and defence policy, whenever our interests converge, as they often, if not always, will, this will not, in my view, necessarily require any new treaty or new institutions, because we will not need them, for the simple reason that the UK is not a European power by treaty or by law, but by irrevocable facts of history and geography and language and culture and instinct and sentiment. And in setting train the biggest review of foreign and defence and security policies since the Cold War, which is designed to seize the opportunities that lie ahead and make sure that we play our part in addressing the world's problems. I know that we will do it in cooperation with our European friends. And I say to our European friends, many of whom I'm delighted to say, representatives of whom I'm delighted to say I see in this room, we are here as ever, as we have been for decades, for centuries, to support and to help, as we've done over the last 100 years or more. And the reason I stress this need for full legal autonomy, the reason we do not seek membership or part membership of the customs union or alignment of any kind, is at least partly that I want this country to be an independent actor and catalyst for free trade, as I have said, across the world. I was there when they negotiated the Uruguay round. I saw it completed in Geneva when they gavelled it out, and it was one of those events that people hardly reported, but it was a fantastically important event in the life of the world. And it was a critical moment, in my view, that helped to lead to almost 2 decades of global growth and confidence. And then in 2008, we saw the abject failure of the Doha round. And though there were many culprits, there can be no doubt that both the EU and the US bear a heavy share of the blame for their refusal to compromise on farm subsidies. And of course, while we were in, the voice of the UK, though important, was muffled. And as we come out, I don't wish to exaggerate our influence or our potential influence, but then nor would I minimize the eagerness of our friends around the world to hear once again our independent voice in free trade negotiations. And our objective is to get things started again, not just because it's the right thing for the world, but of course because it's right for Britain, and because this people's government believes that the whole country will benefit and it will help our national programme to unite and to level up and to bring together our whole United Kingdom, and by expanding our trading relationships to improve the productivity of the entire nation, and by expanding infrastructure, education and technology. You know that our programme is to bring this country together. Combine that with greater free trade, and of course I hope that you will see us exporting more fantastic ships built on the Clyde, more wonderful bone china pottery from Northern Ireland, beef from Wales. The opportunities, as I say, are extraordinary. It is an incredible fact that we still sell not one single hamburger's worth of beef to the United States, not one kebab's worth of land. And as I speak, the people of the United States are still rubbing along, surviving, without an ounce of Scottish haggis, which they continue to ban, Mr. Ambassador. In fact, I don't know how they manage Burns Night. I'm glad to say that the Chinese, on the other hand, last year signed the first agreement to take British beef after a 20-year ban. There's still no lamb, not a joint, not a chop, not a frozen moussaka, even though we have, of course, the best lamb in the world. And don't tell me that the issue is distance from China. Let me ask a question, see if you've been paying attention to this speech. New Zealanders sell huge and growing quantities of lamb to China, as indeed they do to America. Well, let me tell you, let me ask you, which is closer to Beijing, Wales or New Zealand? Does anybody know? Wales is, of course, the correct answer. Right. There is no reason why we cannot do much, much better. And I'm deeply proud, of course, of I don't want to do down this country's incredible exporting spirit. We do extraordinary things, as I never tire of telling you. Tea to China, increasing quantities of chocolate cake to France, TV aerials to South Korea, boomerangs to Australia, and Nigel Farage to America, though he came back, of course. But this is the moment. This is the moment when we think back to our past, to the spirit that made this country great, and this is the moment for us to go up a gear again and to recapture the spirit of those seafaring ancestors immortalized above us, whose exploits brought us not just riches, but something far more important than that. And that was a truly global perspective. So that is our ambition. So there you go. There lies the port, the vessel puffs her sail, the wind sits in the mast, to mix my poets up a bit. We are embarked now on a great voyage, a project that no one thought in the international community that this country would have the guts to undertake. But if we are brave, and if we truly commit to the logic of our mission, open, outward-looking, generous, welcoming, engaged with the world, championing global free trade now when global free trade needs a champion, I believe that we can make a huge success of this venture for Britain, for our European friends, and for the world. Thank you all very much for coming along this morning. And thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Don't worry. I've got to take some questions. Thank you. You're not obliged to stand up, folks. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for coming. I want to say something quickly, if I can now, about the events in Streatham last night. And first of all, of course, I want to thank the police very much for their speedy and very brave response to what took place. And I think the question that everybody has about the individual concerned is, what was he doing out on automatic early release, and why was there no system of scrutiny, no parole system to check whether he was really a suitable candidate for automatic early release? And that is a very complex legal question, and as you know, we're bringing forward legislation to stop the system of automatic early release, but the difficulty is how to apply that. I see the AG in the front row, how to apply that retrospectively to the cohort of people who currently qualify. We do think it's time to take action to ensure that people, irrespective of the law that we're bringing in, people in the current stream do not qualify automatically for early release. Terrorist people convicted of terrorist act offences, and you will be hearing shortly from the Justice Secretary, from Robert Buckland, about what proposals we intend to bring forward. But I hope people understand that the anomaly we need to clear up is the process by which some people are still coming out under automatic early release without any kind of scrutiny or parole system. I'm now going to go to the media and happy to take questions. I'm going to start with, is Beth Rigby here from Sky?
I'm here. Thank you, Prime Minister. Just firstly, on the terrorist attack, can you reassure the public that people coming out of our prisons are not more dangerous than they are going in after this atrocious attack? And just on Brexit, you said in the election that there was absolutely zero chance that the UK would leave the EU with no deal. Now you seem to be talking up no deal as an Australian-style arrangement if the EU insists the UK aligns with their rules. Can you level with the public that the deal, that the chance of absolutely zero chance of no deal is rapidly moving to being a real option? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, Beth, on the issue of what happens to terrorist convicts or people convicted of terrorist offences in prison, I have to say, concerned about the way we handle them. It is very, very difficult. We have an issue about, when if you have about 200 or so inside, the question is, how do you detain them? Do you detain them as en bloc, as it were, in one group, and try to keep them together, because that avoids them, as it were, infecting or passing the virus of their beliefs to others in jails, or do you disperse them and try to stop them reinfecting each other? And that's a very, very difficult problem. And Beth, I'm going to level with you. I think looking at the problems we have with re-educating and reclaiming and rehabilitating people who succumb to Islamism, it's very, very hard and very tough. And it can happen, but the instances of success are really very few. And we need to be frank about that. And we need to think about how we handle that in our criminal justice system. Now, on the deal, we have a deal. What I said during the election, you'll have heard me say many, many times, we have a deal, it's a great deal, and it was oven ready and it's gone through. And we look forward to building a new relationship, not just with the EU, but with friends and partners around the world. And Gary from Channel 4 News, Gary Gibbon.
Thank you very much. Just on that euphemism of choice now for no deal, a trading relationship corresponding to Australia's with the EU, that is a new euphemism for no deal, isn't it? Because there is no trade agreement you can point to. And wouldn't you require an awful lot of infrastructure by the end of this year if we were to end up in that sort of place? And can I just put to you one quote from Michel Barnier this morning, who said, "You can't possibly be surprised by the requirements that the EU is wanting to put on Britain if we get to a Canada-style trade agreement. It's all in the political declaration, robust commitments because of geographical proximity. We're not Canada. You always knew you were going to get that, didn't you? You're not really surprised. You're not saying the goalposts have moved, are you?" So, Gary, as I said to Beth, we have a deal. We have come out on the basis of that deal. And as for the political declaration, it makes it very clear that both sides will commit to high standards. And I think everybody here this morning will agree that I quite laboriously explained that in many instances the UK's standards are higher than those of the EU, but we do not place any requirement upon the EU to conform with our standards, nor do we think that that rule should apply vice versa. Mesa Hall, The Express.
Thank you, Prime Minister. The EU has indicated that it wants to listen to Spain and ensure that Gibraltar is not included in any trade deal. Will you stand up to defend the Rock against this?
Yes. Thanks, Mesa. Well, I can definitely confirm to you and to the people of Gibraltar that the UK will be negotiating on behalf of the entire UK family, and that certainly includes Gibraltar, and the sovereignty of Gibraltar remains, as everybody knows, indivisible. Francis Elliott, The Times.
Hello, Prime Minister. What legal underpinning will there be for your commitments on state aid, for instance, competition, environment? I mean, how are you going to reassure the EU in legal effect that you got? And just on your remarks on US standards, do you believe that people who have concerns about chlorinated chicken, for instance, believe in mumbo jumbo. What could you say a little bit more about the mumbo jumbo that you think the American bashers are portraying?
Yeah. On the legal underpinnings, perhaps the best thing I can do is direct you to the WMS that's being laid very shortly, the written ministerial statement. But I think I've given a pretty clear account of what we want. We want a Canada-style deal. There are ways in which Canada and the EU can look at issues that arise as between them over state aids or whatever, or the environment or the other issues that you mentioned. And on mumbo jumbo, look, I don't want to. All I'm saying is we're governed by science. I don't wish to single out any particular belief as being mumbo jumbo. I totally understand the concerns about chlorinated chicken. That is because it's not a hygiene issue. It's an animal welfare issue. And what we will do is use our negotiations to persuade our partners to, if they want to trade freely with us, then obviously they'll have to accept our approach to animal welfare. And that seems to me to be reasonable. So, but there are other issues where I think that I've heard a certain amount of hysterical, and there's a sort of thing about it as though American food was somehow inferior. I mean, I look at the Americans; they look pretty well nourished to me, and I don't hear any of these people. I don't hear any people coming, any of these critics of American food coming back from the United States and complaining. I think you've served in. I think you've reported many times, Francis, from I don't hear people complaining about the quality of the food they were offered in the United States. So let's just be a little. Let's take some of the paranoia out of this argument. Tom Newton-Dunn from the Sun.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Just to be clear, the Canada deal with the EU does have some level playing field provisions in it. Are you saying you will accept some sort of legal binding level playing field, but not necessarily the EU standards, some international global standards perhaps? And just quickly on the terror attack yesterday, is it now time to consider looking again at bringing back control orders? Because there's always going to be a problem with releasing suspects. TPIMs, it would appear from the two attacks we've just had, have consistently failed. Yeah,
thanks, Tom. Well, I think look, the best thing I can say on our approach is look at the Canada deal. You want a pretty smooth and unintrusive system of resolving differences in the way that I described to Francis, but without the need for any kind of EU jurisdiction, the European Court of Justice, or anything remotely approaching that. And we're confident that we can do that on the Canada model. But again, I direct you to the WMS. On TPIMs and control orders, there's a lot of discussion about that, as you can imagine. But my anxiety is that we do not want to get back to a system where you have a lot of very, very laborious surveillance by our hard-push security services, by the CT operation, by the Met, when a custodial version might be better. And looking at the case of Faraz Aman, for instance, and Usman Khan that preceded him, I cannot help but think, as I said at the time and as I say to you today, I cannot help but think that the custodial option would have been better in both cases, Tom. Jason Groves from the Mail.
Thanks, Prime Minister. I mean, cases like yesterday make people's blood boil. We're told there's 200 or so terrorist offenders due for early release in the coming months. Can you give us a guarantee? You've talked about the difficulties. Can we have a guarantee those people won't be released unless they're deemed safe? And on Brexit, you got through a half-an-hour speech without mentioning the Brexit word. Is it banned? What's happened to it?
It's not banned. It's just over. It's happened. It is receding. It is like the glorious revolution that preceded the events chronicled above. It's gone. It is, as they say, I won't say it's like the Big Bang or the Norman Conquest, but it's receding behind us in history, and that's the approach we should take to it. And on Jason, on your point about a guarantee, I wait to see what Robert Buckland has to say later on. What we want to do is to make sure that people convicted of terrorist act offences are not let out without some process of parole or scrutiny by real experts in the matter, cynical, hardened people who can look into their eyes and really think whether or not these people, again, pose a danger to the public. And I think that's a reasonable thing to require. The law, as it stands at the moment, demands automatic release, unscrutinized release, and that, I think, and most members of the public would agree, is not the right way, not the right way forward. Any other questions? A forest of hands. Okay, I'll take 5 more, and then we'll knock it on the head. Laura Koonsberg.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. You keep saying that you have a deal, but the deal that you did was the divorce deal. You do not yet have a long-term deal with the EU. If it is a choice between no comprehensive deal or sticking to EU rules, you've suggested you would rather have no comprehensive deal. But do you accept that that might have significant costs for jobs, businesses and people's prosperities, as well as the benefits that you claim there might be?
Yeah. Laura, I just want to repeat what I said earlier on. We've got a deal. It's a great deal. We're out. And when I hear prophecies of doom, I've heard them before. I don't believe in them. This is a fantastically robust, dynamic economy, and will continue to be so. Next, please. Could you? I'm afraid Robert Peston.
Prime Minister, you've just delivered an encomium to free trade. You've also said there's absolutely no question of a race to the bottom when it comes to workers' rights, the environment, state aid. Can you explain in language that the British people can understand
what, as opposed to what I've already been saying?
No, I haven't asked the question yet. As I say, if you could just explain to the British people what is so terrible about the idea of agreeing in a treaty those standards won't fall below EU standards if, on your view, a freer trade deal with the EU, a better deal with the EU, will make the country richer?
Well, we have a treaty. We had a treaty by which those things were agreed. It was called EU membership, and this country voted not once, not twice, but 3 times that they wanted to end that. And there's no point in trying to restore that. What we can do is both of us, equal sovereign partners, the EU and the UK, is look very carefully at what each other are doing, and believe me, the UK will continue to set standards for social, environmental protections that will lead the world, not just the EU. And that's the approach that I think the UK public will want us to take. And as I say, I think it's very unlikely that the EU, I would agree any treaty by which they had to do exactly what we decided to do. And as I say, by the same token, we are not going to do the same. Who's there? Yes, you, sir. Yes.
Prime Minister, Stephen Drill from News Corp Australia. How important and how much of a priority is a trade deal with Australia to you and to the UK?
Well, it's hugely important, and Prime Minister ScoMo, in fact, texted me, I think, on Friday to say how eager he was to get on and do it. We're very excited by all those. Liz, when you say that it's one of the it's one of the first 4, but that doesn't exclude many others that we'll be doing, as I say, simultaneously. Yes, sir. On the right. Yes.
Thank you. Yannis Andrizopoulos with a Greek daily newspaper, Tanea. Prime Minister, there has been a Brexit Day poster that demanded foreigners speak English or leave the UK. Do you condemn this, and do you fear that xenophobic attacks will be triggered following Brexit? Thank you.
I do. And I think that people should, of course, I think it's a wonderful thing that people should learn English. And and people living here for a long time should definitely do that, and they should be helped to do that. And we put a lot of money into teaching, into people to learning English for speakers of other languages. That's absolutely right. But the idea that you propose is certainly new to me. I haven't heard that one. Last question, Gary Gibbon. You've asked one. Sorry, forgive me. I just saw you there. I'm trying to think of people I can recognize. Hang on. Paul Wall.
Prime Minister, former prosecutor Nazir Afzal this morning said he had a conversation with you 4 years ago about the dangers of terrorists still being radicalised in prison. He said to you, it's resources for one-to-one mentoring and de-radicalisation that's needed. You said, but that's money again. Were you suggesting that money is an object when it comes to our security?
I think if you listen to what I just said, Paul, I think one of the sad things about it, although as Rishi Sunak explained very clearly this morning, we've invested massively in CT and in de-radicalisation. The sad thing is that it seems to be mentally and emotionally for these men, and I'm afraid it is almost always men, but not exclusively, it's a very, very tough nut to crack. De-radicalising people is a very, very difficult thing to do. It just seems to be there's a big psychological barrier that people find it hard to get back over. And that's why I stress the importance of the custodial option. And that's why I've come to the end of my patience with the idea of automatic early release. And I hope that people will understand why we're doing that. This is a liberal country, it's a tolerant country, but I think the idea of automatic early release for people who obviously continue to pose a threat to the public has come to the end of its useful life. Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you.